Good day, students. Welcome to our next lesson. Today, we will be looking at applications of environmental communication strategies in a dynamic global environment. So our next slide tells us exactly what we will be looking at in this week's lesson. So so this lesson will be relatively short. We are focusing on two things really: describing and applying the principles of risk communication, and we will also be doing the same for disaster communication. So it's important that you understand the distinction between the two and even the relationship, as a matter of fact. Okay, so let's begin with risk communication. So what is risk communication? Risk communication provides the community with information about a specific type of exposure, whether it's a good exposure or a bad exposure, and as well as the magnitude of it. Is it strong or is it weak? So information must be provided concerning this, let's call it a vulnerability. All right, so remember what a vulnerability is. It's whatever pre-existing conditions, whether it's environmental or whether it's a community or people's behavior, how does that increase your risk to exposure to a particular hazard? Okay, so we're talking about communication regarding that. So bear in mind, when we talk about risk communication, as we go along, you will see risk communication is one part of the risk management process. And, risk management must take place as part of your disaster or crisis preparation mode. It should happen before any crisis actually occurs. So risk communication may originate from official sources at various levels. We have international levels. Say, for example, we have with regards to the COVID-19 crisis that the world is facing, we have risk communication that can come from WHO. We have risk communication that can come from the United Nations regarding climate change issues. Then it can come from national levels as well as local authorities. At a national level, again, if we use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, we have our Ministry of Health and various other local levels of agencies. So still on the second point, it may also be from other sources such as industry, trade, consumers, and other interested parties. So these may also be sources where that they themselves may pose or be exposed to a particular risk. So information may have to come from them, and anyone else who may be affected, let's call them stakeholders or other affected parties. Information may also come from them regarding risks. So the goal of risk communication is to provide meaningful, relevant, and accurate information in a clear and understandable manner. Terms must be understandable, targeted to a specific audience. So remember, we've discussed before the necessity of being mindful of your audience, because the type of language that you use, the jargon that you use, it must be appropriate to your audience. Okay, last point there on this slide. Effective risk communication should have goals that build and maintain trust and confidence. We've also talked previously about the necessity of that level of trust and the necessity of integrity on the part of those who are providing that information to a particular audience. Is necessary that that audience would perceive those communicating the information as trustworthy and as having integrity. So that's very important. So we continue. So risk communication, as I mentioned before, is an integral part of the risk management process. When a crisis or emergency occurs, the situation must be assessed and monitored for emerging or secondary threats, right? Resources must be allocated, and personnel and materials must overcome any logistical or safety barriers, any barriers that may pose obstacles in terms of implementing your process. All right. And in this case, your planning, how should I put it? Your risk assessment and disaster management plan would include planning having access to the affected areas. So anything that can pose obstacles, you want to assess that situation and put things in place to ensure that those barriers are not there, or at least you have alternatives or ways around it. So this essentially kind of outlines both the risk management process. As I mentioned, you're reminded that the risk management process would take place as part of your planning and mitigation measures. Okay. And then of course you will have another process, a planning process in place to deal with response to the crisis and the emergency if and when it occurs. Next point, for the affected people to act in a quick and effective manner, they need information on the situation, and they also need information on how to stay safe. So they need information as to what is happening with the particular hazard, details as to, say we're talking about a hurricane on its way. They need information. How far away is it? What is the strength? What is the likely outcome in terms of levels of rainfall, wind strength, all of these things. But they also need information in terms of how they should behave. What can they do to secure themselves? So the communicator should be an expert who is not directly impacted by the threat. Typically, you find the communicator might be a third-party individual, and they may actually be communicating from a different, safer location. If you recall, when you studied disaster management, you would have learned about incident command systems. And as part of incident command system, you'd always have a communication center from which information can be communicated. Also, with regards to the risk communication, timing is important. So the timing is one where the threat is anticipated. So because of historical facts and trends, you know that an area might be vulnerable to a particular type of hazard. So you know it's anticipated. It's likely to happen again. Okay. However, there is little or no time pressure in that you don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but you know it's likely to happen. All right. So your communication, your risk communication is important here because you have to prepare the community for the eventuality that it will happen, even though we don't have a date or time concerning the hazard. So the purpose of the message in risk communication is to empower decision-making by all parties affected. So not only decision makers in the risk management process and the disaster management process, but also the community. The community needs to be empowered to know how to behave, how to secure themselves from harm. So let's look at some basic principles of risk communication. 1, know your audience. So the message must be tailored to your audience, as we have discussed many times in previous lessons. You should understand what motivates them, what their opinions are, because they would have opinions on the situation. They would have experiences. They may even have some knowledge that can actually contribute to the entire risk management process. What are their concerns? What are their feelings? What are their fears? So you would have to know your audience so that as a risk communicator, you would be able to address some of those fears. Is it lack of information, lack of knowledge and understanding about a particular issue? You need to know your audience to prepare for that. Number 2, involve scientific experts. So the scientists, they assist in assessing and explaining the risk to all interested parties. They must be able to clearly communicate what they know and what they do not know. Very important. So their scope of knowledge in terms of facts, what facts are available, they have to be able to communicate that, but they also have to be honest about what information they do not have. Again, let me use, this COVID-19 pandemic case is such a big one, and we have so many different examples that we can pull from. So for example, in the case of COVID-19, the scientists can provide certain facts about what they already know, but there's much that they do not yet know, especially when it comes to predicting how the virus would behave over a long period of time. They cannot project into the future far into the future what that might look like. Even with regards to the vaccine, there's only a limited amount of information that they do know long term, because we are still in the middle of it. That's why it's called the novel coronavirus. It is so new, and information and learning is still, we're still in the process. All right. So it's important to explain the uncertainties related to the risk assessment process. All right, because you don't want science to be withholding certain types of information that can actually be detrimental to the community or the audience with which they are communicating. Number 3, establish expertise in communication. So identify expertise in conveying understandable and usable information to all interested parties. So this takes a skill. Risk managers and technical experts, they may not have the time or they may not have the skill, because this is a very complex process. Risk communication is very complex. So you may have to rely on third-party expertise with regards to the communication process itself. Persons who are trained. This is why you have, again, let me go back to the our local COVID-19 risk communication process. This is why you find when our authorities, they are doing their daily conference updates, you would often find you have involved the persons who are public relations trained professionals involved as well. Number 4, be a credible source of information. Information from credible sources is more likely to influence public perception of a risk than information from sources that lack this attribute. If consistent, now note this is important here, if consistent messages are received from multiple sources, then the credibility of the message is reinforced. All right, so not only multiple sources, because the reality is, think about what's going on in the world around you. The reality is you could have multiple sources that are also given fake and false information. So you need to be careful about who you are receiving information from. All right, so as a risk communication principle, it is important that number 1, information comes from credible sources, people who are experts on the issue, not persons who have little to no knowledge on it and just have opinions. That is not a credible source of information. And I'm sure you understand why I am emphasizing this particular issue here, because more and more we see happening in the world that we actually have a crisis of false information out there. It is literally a crisis now. So please be careful about the sources that you receive information from. And when you do receive some information, do your due diligence by seeking out corroboration or confirmation from other credible sources of information. So from the perspective of research, and this is something that we talk about in our environmental problems and analysis course, where part of the research process is triangulation of information. So for those of you who may have done that course already, this should be familiar. What do we mean by triangulation of information? It is a research principle where you gather information about the same thing from different sources, and please note, different credible sources of information in order to confirm the authenticity of the information that you have in front of you. All right. So factors determining source credibility include recognized competence or expertise, as we said, trustworthiness, fairness, and lack of bias. Point 5, shared responsibility is also an important principle for risk communication principles, right? Shared responsibilities, some of the parties would involve regulatory agencies, the media, and industry. So regulatory agencies of government at the national, regional, and local levels, they have a fundamental responsibility for risk communication. All right, so different levels, and we've already identified how you can have agencies at different levels involved in risk communication, and they have a fundamental responsibility, as I said, for the risk communication. They need to determine what the public knows about the risks and what the public thinks of the various options being considered to manage those risks. Because remember, at the same time, we have to be concerned about opportunities for stakeholder involvement in the entire decision-making process. So, because even risk management, stakeholder participation or public participation is important, because the authorities will not have all the information. The authorities will not have all the answers. Sometimes the public that is being affected, they may have, because of experience, that the experiences they may have had regarding some of these threats, they may actually have useful recommendations and provide further information that might be needed by the planners and the managers. Right, so it is important to know what the public knows about the risk and also what they think about it. Also, the media play an essential role in the communication process, such as providing information on immediate risks. So they assist in getting information out there to large and varied audiences, and therefore they have a responsibility, not only getting it out, but getting correct and reliable information out there. And when I talk about media here, I'm not talking about reliable media houses. I'm not talking about social media, because we do have some social media pages, like Facebook pages, that will come from reputable agencies. But what we are talking about here is we're not talking about all these random unknown and unidentified experts who are just putting out all kinds of crazy information out there, right? Additionally, another category of group that would share responsibility would be industry as well. So industry has a responsibility to communicate risk resulting from products or processes that they may be directly involved in. So if you have an organization or a company, is there a risk emanating from either the product that the company produces or a process that they may be involved in, such as, let's say, oil spills or chemical spills from a plant that can affect water quality, neighboring water quality, cases like those. So it's important that if risk is likely, they have a responsibility to get information out. Number 6, differentiate between science and value judgment. What do we mean by that? It is essential to separate facts from values. If you have done environmental ethics, you should already know what we mean by values. So value is what is important to you, right? Right, let's go through that again. It is essential to separate facts from values in considering risk management options. The risk communicator bears this responsibility to explain what is a known fact and where the limits of this knowledge begins and ends. All right, we talked about that already. The scientists, when they provide information, they must be truthful and honest about what they know from what they don't know. All right, this information must be communicated to the community and all who can be affected. Value judgment, on the other hand, involves concepts or what people think or perceive as an acceptable risk for them. What do we mean by that? For example, let's think about flooding. Let's think about flooding in terms of how different parts of Trinidad during a flooding event, the same weather phenomenon has come, but it does not affect everyone the same. It may affect you according to your geographic location, the nature of the landscape. It may affect you. A poor household may not have the kind of physical infrastructure on their property, proper drainage, let's say like retaining walls, all of these things as a rich person may have, or somebody who's more well off. Therefore, you find the poor person would be more likely to be affected than a well-off person, even though you find they are exposed to the same same flooding event. So therefore risk is different for each of those. So that's what we mean when we talk about value judgment and acceptable risk. For each group of persons, what you perceive as a risk or even the different levels of risk may vary. So risk communicators should be able to justify the level of acceptable risk to the public. All right, so they would need to properly communicate that based on the individual or different circumstances of different groups of people based on different criteria. Point 7, assure transparency. For the public to accept the risk analysis process, its outcomes, the process must be transparent. So transparency in risk analysis consists of having the process open and available for scrutiny by interested parties, right? So it must be transparent. Transparency lends to a certain level of trustworthiness as well. So that is very important. Number 8, put the risk in perspective. One way to put a risk in perspective is to examine it in the context of the benefits associated with, say technology or a process that poses the risk. All right, so it's like you have to figure out, like it's a balancing act. What are the benefits? What are the risks? Which one outweighs the other? Are the risks associated with it? Is it acceptable? Is it an acceptable risk? Is it not acceptable? All right. So alternatively, another way may be to compare the risk at issue with other similar or more familiar risks. So that might be another way of trying to understand it, trying to understand the risk. Look at history, or your company records, or whatever the case may be. Look at similar types of risks. And compare what you know about the current risk at hand, the one that you are focused on. How do they compare? All right, so that is perspective. So important note here, the content, the form, and the timing of crisis communication can either reduce and contain the harm or make the situation worse. So let's continue. So we have looked at risk communication in some detail. Now we want to look at disaster or risk communication. So also related to disaster planning, but a little bit different from risk communication. The risk communication process, as we would have seen, would have been part of the planning process that takes place before in preparation for a crisis. Now, some preparation and planning would also have had to take place for crisis communication, but the implementation of this happens during and immediately after the crisis event. Okay, so the communicator should be a member of the organization impacted. If it is a company or a plant where some kind of hazard has occurred, the communicator should come from there, because they should have the facts about the incident. They should also have the facts about what plans they have in place with regards to response to the situation. Additionally, the timing of the communication, it should be urgent. It is also unexpected in the sense that it is unknown, so they must plan for it. Okay, so they must plan for it so that if and when it occurs, they are ready to deal with it immediately. The message purpose in crisis communication, it should be well explained and persuasive to elicit cooperation by all parties. Because remember, if it is an organization or particular location that the crisis or the hazard has occurred, those affected would not necessarily be limited to one group of persons. It can affect several groups. So information must be properly communicated to all the parties that could be affected in order to persuade them to cooperate, especially when a response needs to occur. So let's look at the principles involved here. Number one, the first source of communication often comes from the source. I beg your pardon. The first source of communication often becomes the source against which all other sources are measured. So that first bit of communication is critical. Okay, as we keep saying, it must be reliable, it must be factual, and it must be credible information. Point two, be available and swift. A delay in providing information can worsen the crisis. Persons who might be affected may draw all sorts of wrong conclusions as to what is really happening. If information is not provided, they do not know how to respond or how to behave. They may put themselves in even more danger. So it's critical to have a plan already in place and if something happens, be ready to immediately implement. Number three, it must be accurate, and it is critical to credibility, as we've already discussed that issue of credibility there. In other words, accuracy of information. When we talk about credibility, integrity has to do with trust. That's point four. Honesty is fundamental to maintaining trust with all parties impacted, because if you as a communicator, the public was those who would be affected do not perceive you as being honest, trustworthy, and having integrity, they are not likely to listen to you. They're not likely to cooperate with you, and that can worsen the situation. Do not point fingers. This is not helpful. It does not matter who is right and who is wrong in times of a crisis. In times of crisis, that can only cause confusion. The focus and the goal must always be on solving the problem. Where, as we would have discussed before, where you can focus on something that you have in common, which is solving the problem, it helps you to avoid conflict in the situation as you are all focused on the same thing. Point six, express empathy. Emotion cannot be countered with facts. People must first know that their leaders care. So if a public is dealing with fear over a situation that is looming before them, your communicators really need to be prepared to deal with that fear. we would have talked about, different barriers to communication before. And this can be one of those barriers. If you do not address the fears of the people, they are not even going to hear the facts. And this is the reality. Human emotion can actually cause us to cause our perspective on things to actually be distorted. So that has to a skilled communicator needs to be prepared to deal with that. Promote action. Giving people something specific to do restores a sense of control over out of control circumstances. For example, what actions should they take in order to secure themselves from harm? So you find a lot of our disaster management agencies, they would tell you, okay, well, if you're caught in an earthquake, this is what you need to do. What's it called again? Duck hold cover. If you're having if there's a pending tsunami coming, run for higher ground, things like that. So at least, you have something to do that you can feel all right. You have some level of control over your own safety. Point 8, show respect. Lack of respect for a public in crisis undermines trust. So this may even come back to the whole issue at point 6 with expressing empathy. So you can see some overlap with some of these points that we're making here. That respect is important. You don't want to treat people like they don't matter, or at least have them believe that they don't matter. So that is important. They're not going to trust you if they feel like they're not being heard, if they feel like they are not important. Point 9, be responsive when working with the media. Withholding information can cause public anxiety. Remember, we talked about that in a previous lesson as well. Withholding information or filtering information by means of withholding some of the information, that is actually a level of dishonesty there. So brings us back to point 4 about honesty and integrity. So it's important to make all the important information available to the public in order to don't leave gaps in information for people to have to imagine all sorts of things. That's essentially what we mean. So in summary, what are we saying? When it comes to reducing risk or minimizing the impact of disaster, we must properly assess the situation and select communication approaches that meet the goals of each of those approaches and the particular situation. So proper selection of approaches, as we have discussed in this lesson so far. So when we miss our communication goals, lives can be lost, property and the environment can be irreparably damaged. Okay, so these are some of the points that you really want to get out of this lesson. So what will we be looking forward to activity-wise for this lesson? So again, you are referred to the reading materials available in the Unit 5 resources link. And the activity for this week would be your second individual assignment, also worth 5% of your final grades. What is it? You will be required to develop a press release on an environmental topic. You would be provided with a template. So you will find these resources on eClassroom. So please refer to eClassroom for details on the activity. So thank you again for joining me for today's lesson, and I will see you online.